Hi everybody, receive greetings from Oklahoma. I made it to the US and I am very, very delighted to actually come back to you and teach public and social policy analysis. I apologize for the delay, and I am also very, very sorry to hear about the strike that is going on for the lecturers. All I can do is to encourage you and tell you to hang in there. Spend your time wisely during the time that you guys are not learning. I would encourage you to go out there and look for opportunities to volunteer. Like I've always said, sometimes when you volunteer in a course, or you never know, you might discover your passion. You might discover that that is your future job or career. You make relationships, and so I just want to encourage you guys: don't waste time, don't get discouraged. Let's hope that the lecturer strike will stop soon. And for now, let's move on to our slides. And I hope that you guys are ready with a pen and paper. And I hope probably you have already actually printed the slides. So I will take you through the slides, and I hope to see you soon. Bye. Hey guys, I just let me do a flashback on what we have been talking about. We've been talking about public policy. Public policy is what we've been talking about. We've talked about the process of actually making policy, starting from agenda setting. So I just want to remind you that the public policy is the action to protect the Kenyan citizens. And when I talk about the action, is whatever plan that we actually make to protect the Kenyan citizen is what we call the policy. So that would be the public policy. Uh, Public policy is also actually geared towards providing assistance to Kenyans or to the world, because sometimes we can make a policy that actually not just assist the Kenyans when they're in problems. Even countries like Sudan, that we have a policy for refugees. We have a policy of helping fight the war. Like, for example, when Kenyan army is usually sent to a place like Sudan to keep peace, that is also a public policy, but it's not necessarily just for Kenyans. It can also be for the world or just the neighboring countries. So that's just a refresher, so that you can remember what we'll be talking about public policy. So we're gonna move on to the next slide, and I hope you guys are keeping pace. I've decided not to actually videotape my face as I teach this with the slides. I don't know if it's you guys are gonna prefer it, or you're going to probably prefer when you can see my face, but I just wanted to make sure that it's not a distraction, because I touch my hair so many times, especially when I'm looking at the camera. So I just want to make sure that I keep it professional. But if you would prefer to probably see my face, you can let me know. But let's hope that this is going to be effective. Okay, move on to the next slide. Now we remember what public policy is. So let's go to slide number 3. Okay, in this slide, I want us to also recap on the process of policy making. And the first step, remember, it was the setting of the agenda, or just identifying the problem. So this is a stage where the stakeholders will sit down and actually try to identify the problem. They want to find out what is the social problem. What are the citizens talking about? For example, it can be something like environmental pollution, when people just discover that there is too much pollution and they want to take care of that problem. So the stakeholders are going to sit down and actually try to strategize on how to actually reduce pollution, or just empower people to make sure that they're keeping their environment clean. So what kind of an environment would you want, or would the stakeholders want, so that they can sit down and actually make that agenda? or come up with with the agenda for making policy. So we have to say that the stakeholders are definitely going to require a conducive environment, and I'm not just talking about the geographical environment per se. I'm talking about something, atmosphere that is actually welcoming, atmosphere that is empowering, an atmosphere that is actually friendly, so that people can sit down and agree when they come together to try and identify problems or solutions for solving those kind of problems. So the stakeholders will come together and identify the problems, and they decide on what they need the measures to take so that they can actually provide a solution. Of course, we are hoping that the solution they're going to come up is a long-term solution. Is a long-term solution. So what needs to happen in that environment or that atmosphere is to have stakeholders who can actually come together, agree or disagree, and at some point be able to compromise. Because when the stakeholders come with their different interests or their different agendas, and they're not representing actually the larger public, it can be a problem. But what needs to happen is that when they come together, even though it's not their interests that are actually being represented there, they can be able to come to a point where they can compromise and say, hey, we're doing this for the larger community, we're doing this for the larger society, and we do need to compromise our interests. So that kind of an environment is very, very important, especially at this stage where which is very, very, very critical. So we talked about compromising, and of course it's making sure that even though their personal interests are not met, they have to make sure that they compromise. They actually agree and say, hey, we identify this as a problem. This is what everybody in the community talking about. This is what they desire. And so they have to make sure that they agree that that is the agenda they are going to set for that policy process making. All right. The factors that we outlined, the geographical factors, the human factors, but I want to stress this point that the most important factor for creating or formulating a policy is the nature of governance, is the nature of government, of government, or the governance. The existing governance, is this governance actually conducive? Does it allow for policy making? Does it allow for people to actually voice their concerns? Does it allow for new policies to be introduced to actually get rid of the policies that are not actually effective, or policies that are not benefiting the society, or are not meeting the needs of the citizen? If you have a government that is not democratic, a government that is not democratic, whether it is in an agency, whether it's in a country, whether it's in an organization, a democratic system would actually allow other stakeholders to actually give their views. Of course, maybe challenge a policy, or even introduce a policy, or just give recommendations. So you have to have a good government. You have to have a good, smooth running government that is actually out there to protect the citizens or the stakeholders, and of course make the best decisions that do not harm but rather protect the people. Okay. Right. I guess we are in the fourth slide of the 14 slides. We're going to talk about policy making in our country, Kenya. There are some major factors or major characteristics that do affect policy making in developing countries, especially a country like Kenya. And so some of those reasons or some of those factors would be associated with, one person wanting to keep the legacy of the other. For example, number one, we talk of inheritance of power, where, somebody maybe inherited power from their daddy, you've had countries where actually presidents have been leaving the power in the hands of their, of their sons or things, or their wives, things like that. So when you have when you have such kind of a situation, it is very, very hard for the new president to come and change policy, because this feels like it's a family thing, and we have to keep the legacy of my dad, or we have to keep the legacy of my grandfather, so we can't change anything. Things are going to stay in the same status quo. So you might have something like that preventing a country from making new policies, or even having somebody like, for example, I can give an example of the free education that was actually begun, or brought back by President Kibaki. When Uhuru took power, he can say, okay, I feel like, President Kibaki did his best, and, I honor that man, and I really want to, respect his policies. So we're not going to change anything about public policy. It's good. That was his project, and so you might find in such situations where actually the country does not progress in terms of even evaluating those kind of policies, because they feel like they want to keep the policy, the legacy of a certain president. You might have just their patterns of of doing things. Presidents are known to do this, and no president wants, any president that comes, feel like this is the pattern of our country, this is what all the other presidents have done since Kenyatta, then Kibaki, then Moi, those kind of things. So we is it hard for is it hard for the new president to change patterns of doing things or policies, because a certain president left them like that? And so you're going to have to see that in various countries, there are things that really hinder presidents, or even kings, or even prime ministers from putting into place policies that are actually are current, or current policies that actually prevent or protect people, or actually meet the current needs, because those policies are outdated, and the reason is because they were made by one president and they cannot be changed by the other. Another thing would be current government shapes the future of policy making. So if you have a country, for example, a country where a president comes in and says, okay, I'm going to change the way things were done before, and I want to bring new policies, and I want to evaluate the old policies, keep the good ones, and diminish the ones that are not working. That, of course, that affects the policy making of a certain country in a positive way. And then another thing would be there's a weak connection between policy developers, makers, implementers, and the people of the country. So if you don't have a link between the policy developers, the politicians, and the people that voted for them, and the people who are actually going to implement the policy. For example, I was giving an example of a politician who goes to the parliament to make policies that actually benefit them, and not benefit the wananchi, or just have a policy that is actually implemented, but the people who are actually implementing that policy actually detached from their real life. That could be a real major problem, in policy, when it comes to policy making. Of course, lack of strong evaluation mechanism. I've always stressed on this point of actually evaluation mechanism. It's very, very, very important. It's vital to be able to evaluate policies, because that's the only way you know whether the policies you have in place are working, whether they're obsolete, whether you need to change them. Otherwise, it would be useless to make new policies if the old ones were not working, or if the old ones were actually working and you're trying to actually remove them if they were already working or helping the citizens or the stakeholders. Um, all right, let's move to the next one. It would be, while politicians make policies, voters or common mananchis have no role in making the policy. That one, I think it's connected to the third factor, where we are talking about that, the politicians who are in parliament or the people you voted for, they go actually try to make new policies, but they are not asking the common citizen what they are really suffering from, what their problems are, what policies would actually meet their needs, and things like that. So there is no connection between the new policy and the problems that are actually on the ground. So that is not a good characteristic. That's not a good characteristic. Also, manipulated judicial system, lack of experienced people to make policy, or people who just actually have to follow law or have to actually enforce a law just because they are being manipulated by the big government. But is that law protecting the minority, or is it harming the minority? And I've always talked about something like, the traffic laws. Of course, we have people who manipulate the judicial system, or even the police enforcement, because the police are the ones who own matatus or things like that. So when it comes to implementing the policy to actually help somebody on the ground, it does not, because it's actually favoring a certain individual, a certain society, a certain group, rather than everybody that's supposed to benefit from it. And lack of experienced people who make policy. For example, why are you in this class? So that you can be a good policymaker. So why you can understand the policy making process. So if you don't attend any class that actually teaches you how to make policy, how effective are you when it comes to making policy for your country or for your organization or for your agency, wherever you are going end up wherever you are going to be in the next 5 years. It's very, very important that you be experienced, you be trained, and know what the process entails. Okay. Of course, last and not least is the optimal policy versus survival quality. Is it a policy that is just for the system to survive, or the president to survive, or the politicians who are in office to survive, or is it the policy that is actually needed by the country? Is it the optimal policy that the country needs to solve its problems, or is it a policy just for survival? Well, that is what it's you have to make sure that when you are evaluating your policies, you're looking at those things. Is this the right policy? Is this the best we can make for our country? Or is this a policy that is just going to be there because we have nothing else and we need to have a policy in place, whether it's helping or not helping? So those are some of the things that we need to consider. And it's very, very, very important that we make sure that the characteristics that are actually influencing the policy making in our country are actually influenced. They're positive, and you are helping us develop our country, and they're helping us keep people safe and also meet the needs of the citizens. Those are the optimal policies. All right. So we did talk about the process of policy making, and you remember that the last stage, we talked about evaluation. Some of the other characteristics that could really actually affect our policy making process, or even in our country, is lack of a strong evaluation mechanism. Because if you don't have a strong evaluation mechanism, then you'll never be able to know when your policies are failing, when your policies are not actually meeting the needs of the people, or when your policies are actually hurting your citizens. So having a very strong evaluation mechanism is important, because it actually gives you the best results. It tells you what kind of policies that need to be deleted, or what kind of policies need to be added, what kind of policies will need to be actually improved on. So having a very strong evaluation mechanism is a very good characteristic for the country. But unfortunately, I don't know what kind of mechanism we have of evaluating our policy in our country. So that's something that we definitely have to talk about further. Also, another bad characteristic is, we have politicians making all the policies, while the voters or the people who actually suffer or the people who actually have their needs, I mean, want their needs met, do not have a role in policy making. And that's what you're talking about, including all the stakeholders in policy making process, because everybody's voice need to be heard, everybody's ideas need to be heard, and so that we can come up with better solutions that actually meet the needs of everybody, not just the politicians making policy. Unfortunately, that's what we see in many developing countries, or just third world countries. We also have a problem with issues like manipulated judicial system, lack of experienced people who actually make process, or lack of experienced people who actually are seated in those positions where they have to make decisions, they have to make law, they have to implement law, or actually they have to make sure that the law breakers are actually hold or held accountable. That's what happens when you are in a country like Kenya, or even other developing countries where the rules are not very very strict. You might have the politicians or just big people, or other people who actually business people manipulating the judicial system so that the policies that are actually put in place are not really working. I remember giving an example in this class when I talked about things like when you have policies to actually prevent our environment from being polluted by those people who own companies or factories, where factories are actually supposed to be regulated on how they actually dispose of their waste. So you might have a company like that, or a factory, actually the owners of the factory coming to bribe the judges, or the people that are who actually govern those disposal points, and they either pay money, or they just bribe their way out, so those policies are not actually honored, or they are not being implemented against their behavior. So what we really need for even our country like Kenya, for policy to actually make sense, for policy to actually protect the needs of the people, or even the lives of its citizens, we do need optimal policy versus survival quality. Because what I feel like we have in our country is survival quality of kind of policy. So we have a policy, it's in the books, but whatever makes people survive, whatever makes organizations survive, whatever makes the politicians survive for the years that they're in the office, that's what matters. It's not the optimal policy, which should be the best kind of the best quality uh, policy, is what really is going to solve our issues, our social problems, is going to help distribute resources in our country equally or equitably. It's going to protect every citizen, everybody's right. When you have an optimal policy versus a survival quality. So I hope you guys now can probably tell me the difference between optimal versus survival quality policy, because survival, just as it is it's just something you have in the books. It's there's a policy right there in the books, or you just make it to suit some few individuals, and it's not well thought through. So that's the kind of policy we tend to see in our country. So I hope you guys are paying attention, and if you need a break, just pause and you come back later. About policy making in our country, and maybe look at specifically the characteristics of policy making in Kenya, and how some of those how policy is implemented in Kenya, or how policy making is in Kenya. What are some of the things that are actually prevent our policies from being effective in Kenya? What are some of the factors that actually make policies not be implemented in Kenya, or even the process becomes very, very difficult and tedious when it comes to implementing policy or making policy? Okay. So one of the things that we are going to see as one of the characteristics is their policies are not realistic. Some of the policies that you've probably read on the news, or you've actually seen them being gazetted, or you have actually heard that some of the policies need to be implemented, sometimes they are not realistic. And I have to remind you about one of the policies that we talked about last time when we met in class, when we were talking about the illegal substance, like the that pombe, the I don't know what you call it, but the of course the cheap pombe. How realistic was that policy? Because right now, as we know, that cheap beer or alcohol is back in the market. And how is that? It is because some of the policies that are implemented, because of not following the right process, uh, they end up not becoming realistic in the sense that they really do not they don't meet um they actually don't meet the goals that they were intended to meet. They actually don't achieve the goals or the objectives that they're supposed to, because they were not realistic, because they didn't follow the right procedure. They did not involve the stakeholders. They were not well thought, and nobody looked at research on to find out how that kind of a policy would be implemented, or how that kind of a policy would really impact or make changes in the lives of the citizens. Um, another characteristic is that the policy making process might not be economical. If it's not economical, the government is going to reach a point where, oh well, we can't really implement this, or we can't keep following up on this because it is not making any economical sense. If you have a policy that is really actually getting, the cost of implementing that policy are higher than the benefits, or vice versa, it's very, very important to find out whether, somebody thought about it, or somebody really planned on it, and what were the economical effects on the country as a whole. Because some of those policies, if they don't make any economical sense, they are probably going to die off. We have policies that we know that have actually been buried. A long time ago, we used to have, things like, people used to have free, cow dip. It's no longer there. People don't have places where they can go and actually have their animals taken care of, or being sprayed with pesticide or whatever, because that was not an economical policy. It's no longer uh, either bringing any economical benefits to the country, or the country is not able to sustain that kind of a policy. So other policies are going to die because they are not politically achieved. For example, somebody might come up with a manifesto and probably actually come up with a policy that is adopted by the country, but by the end of the day, because it's not going to be supported by the majority of the politicians, it's not gonna be possible to implement that kind of policy, especially in the nationwide, because it's not being supported. Either it's not going to be supported financially, or even socially. So people are not going to talk about it, people are not going to support it, and it's not possible to actually make such kind of a policy, or implement such kind of a policy. uh, Other policies, because they are politically oriented, it can be a challenge to actually implement them, because for example, if somebody just used their political position, or they just maybe talked about a policy that they would like to introduce into the country, maybe to benefit the citizens. Maybe they talk about it in the beginning of the campaign, and then maybe as soon as they get into the office, they try to please the voters, and all of a sudden somebody forgets about it. I mean, by the end of the day, I really didn't care about that policy, because all I needed is the vote. So if the if policy making process is really politicized, it's very, very hard to have those policies actually either made to where they actually make impacts on the lives of the citizens, or even just make improve the the living standards of the human beings in a country, because uh, they were politically influenced. Okay. And finally, what we can find in a country like Kenya, when it comes to policy making, is lack of continuity. Is lack of continuity, and I have to keep giving an example of Mishoki, safety belts policy, because it was there. But how long did we sustain that policy as long as Mishoki was no longer in that office, because there was lack of continuity? And what is the reason? It's because the policy making process was not efficient, was not looked into. It was not a stakeholders contribution. It was probably one person that made the policy, and once they left that office, because there was no the process of implementing or formulating that process was not that policy was not followed, then there are no other people that can actually adopt that policy and actually implement it the right way, because the owner of the policy, that is, for example, Mishoki, is gone, and so there's nobody else to follow up with it. And so we have to make sure that these are some of the things that we really consider as a country, or even as people who go into office, because it's not just the country. Even if it's an organization, if you have this kind of characteristics that are actually showing up when it comes to policy making, you are highly likely to not have a policy at all, because by the end of the day, we need a policy that is well thought. We need a policy that is actually has been made using following the right process. The correct analysis have been done, and well investigated. And of course, use the stakeholders, use all the stakeholders to come up with policies, so that you don't have a policy failure. All right. I hope I hope we are together so far. And now we're gonna move forward. And again, I wanna just stress again, if you have any questions, if there's anything that you probably did not understand, please make sure you do not hesitate to ask me a question. Okay, evaluate again. Why do we evaluate policy? Why do we evaluate policy? Because this is a very important question. Is because history has shown that once implemented, policies are difficult to terminate. Why do we evaluate policy? Because you have to actually begin, when it comes to evaluating a policy, you actually begin from where did this policy actually evolve from, or where was the beginning of this policy? What problem was this policy trying to solve, or what difference was this making? Was it trying to make? You remember when you talked about the agenda setting? You have to go back there. If you are evaluating a policy that you've actually been involved in the process of making, and you want to do an evaluation maybe every 6 months or after the end of the year, you have to go back to the agenda setting. Look at what were the social problems that you were trying to solve? What were the changes that you wanted to make? What is a question that you really wanted to answer by implementing this new policy? And now what you're trying to ask yourself is, did this question, or did this problem that I was trying to solve with a new policy actually get solved, or did you add more problems to it, or did you create more problems with a new policy? So when a policy is terminated, it's usually because the policy became obsolete and did not work. So definitely, when you come to the point where you can't really see whether you were able to answer the question, or you see that the policy that you actually made became more problematic, you're gonna have to abandon or terminate that policy. That's what we're talking about, becoming obsolete because it did not work or actually lost support among the interest groups and elected officials that placed it on the agenda in the first place. So, for example, let's say the politicians all rallied behind a certain policy, and then down, their down the road, they just discover that they can't continue supporting that policy. It definitely becomes obsolete. And so when you're doing the evaluation, this is what you're looking for. What are the policies that are still working? What are the policies that are actually still being supported by the government, or actually being provided for example, financially? And what are some of the policies that are actually still making effect or impact on human lives? Because you can either decide to terminate those policies or actually erase them from your books, but there is no need of having policies that are actually not working or not being implemented. So that's the reason why you evaluate. That's definitely why you evaluate, because you want to make sure that you don't have obsolete policies in your in your books, and then you think that those policies are being followed, but yet they're not. For example, if you probably go back to maybe even the traffic laws or whatever, they have a document, maybe a policy document in the traffic, in the, in the, yeah, let's call the traffic or the transportation ministry, about the safety belts. Maybe they have it there that every passenger has to be wearing a safety belt, and then you go on the ground and find out that nobody is actually wearing those safety belts. That policy is obsolete and needs to be actually removed from the books, or you need to start finding out what needs to happen for that policy to continue, things like that. And that process can only be effective during evaluation, monitoring and evaluation. All right, I think we're doing okay. Okay, now that we have been talking a lot about evaluating policies or evaluating the policies that we have in place, especially in countries where the systems actually work, I wanted to give you an example an absolute policy in the United States in 1974, where the U.S. Congress, actually, which would be maybe the parliament in Kenya, the U.S. Congress enacted a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour. This is, something that you would probably compare with 70 kilometers per hour. But if you want to convert, you can actually do the appropriate conversion to see what 55 miles per hour is equal to in comparison to, kilometers per hour. But this example is really to show you that sometimes we might sit down, just trying to make good policies, and then down in the line we find out that actually those policies are absolute. So it was effective. The speed limit that was set for 55 miles per hour was effective in reducing highway fatalities and gasoline consumption on the roads. And these are, we're talking about big trucks, those kind of, I think we call them trailers in Kenya, the ones that actually carry a lot of loads. So when the speed limit was set, obviously it was effective. It reduced the highway fatalities or deaths and gasoline consumption, because when the car is moving at a slower speed, is actually not consuming as much gas. But when the law was being evaluated, or when they came back, they found out that the law increased the cost of trucking industry and was widely viewed as an unjustified government intrusion into an area that belonged to the states to regulate. So what this is the United States is a lot of states. It's just like, maybe for example, like, when you say the United States, like in Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas. So they are supposed to govern themselves because the states usually have the governors, which would be equivalent to a president in Kenya. So what happened is that this law that actually was enacted in 1974 was made by the US Congress, which is the combined state. So when they came back to evaluate, even though it was an effective rule, they came back, the states that were affected came back and actually repealed. It's like you go back to the parliament and say, hey, this rule, this law, we know it's working, but it's not justified because the government that actually made it is not the state government, it's the US Congress government. So what they did is they repealed, and actually in 1987 the law was announced as obsolete, and that means the law was deleted. So you can have obsolete laws, not because they're not working. It is because the people that actually come back, maybe for example, if you have a president that is make laws, and then you have a new president that is elected next year and can come back and say, hey, this law was not justified, so they just make it obsolete. People can repeal, and this is, we're talking about of a system that really works, because I know that there are some, there's some laws or policies in our country that actually are not, cannot be justified, but they are there maybe to punish some individuals, or just maybe some people put them there for selfish reasons. But when they can go back to the parliament and they actually sit down and debate, they can say, we don't want this law to continue, we don't want this policy because of this ABCD. And that process is usually through the evaluation process. That's when you determine whether you need to repeal a policy, or whether you need to actually go back and debate about it, so that you don't have to continue carrying on with a policy that is actually not effective, or it's not justified. So that's an example of an obsolete policy. One thing I want to warn you, because there's gonna be a time where policy analysis and policy evaluation are going to actually overlap. It's not because that these two terms are the same, but I'm going to try my best to make sure that I keep them distinct, to where you don't get confused. But let's talk about public policy analysis as a technique that is used in public administration to enable civil servants, activists, and others to examine and evaluate the available options to implement laws and rules. So these people are not just sitting down, the analysts are not just sitting down to identify the problems, they are also sitting down to look at the available options of the laws and the rules. The policies are already in place. Are these options that have been provided to the public, or to the country, going to actually protect are they protecting the citizens? Are they meeting the needs of the citizens? So it's a kind of an evaluation, but these ones are actually sitting down to criticize what is already in place. Okay. Public analysis also refers to all the laws, regulations, and other programs developed by governments to solve social problems. So that's why I say that these two words are going to be, or these two terms are going to be they are going to be overlapping or interacting with each other, but there is a difference between policy analysis and policy evaluation. So let's continue learning about policy analysis, and we'll come back to the policy evaluation. And I hope that is not confusing to you guys. Okay. So in simpler terms, or trying to make sure that you don't get confused, I want to define policy analysis just for this class, how we're going to be defining policy analysis in simpler terms. Policy analysis can be defined in simple terms as the systematic evaluation of the policy process, the policy alternatives, and policy outcomes. So, remember the remember the policy evaluation. You are looking at the end product, and how that end product is serving the community, or the end product is actually meeting the needs of the citizens, while the policy analysis is actually looking at the process of making policy. It's like it's looking at the whole policy making process and analyzing and making sure that the process that was actually used is the right one. The process of policy making was actually followed, and also look at the policy alternatives. What did the stakeholders or the people who are making policy, what did they come up with as alternatives, and what was actually implemented, and what is that implementation, what does that implementation looks like in terms of improving the quality of life, in terms of distributing resources. So that's why we will, in a nutshell, define policy analysis as a systematic evaluation of policy process, the policy and alternatives, and policy outcomes. So I hope this is clear, this is not confusing, and I hope that you actually are able to differentiate between the policy process, policy evaluation and policy analysis. And I hope this makes it clear. So what you have to make sure that these three things you can actually remember when you define public and policy analysis, that it's the process. You're actually evaluating the process, you're evaluating the policy alternatives, and also you're also looking at the policy outcomes. Okay. And of course, like every other policy making process, we have a process of policy analysis. The policy analysis process is the process of policy analysis also used in the administration. For example, in different countries, different organizations and different agencies do have their own policy analysis process. Okay, and what they have is that they have all this number of policies that they have to actually look at how they have been developed, how they have been actually implemented, what are the options and what are the outcomes. So the process of determining which policies will achieve a given set of goals and determine the relationship between policies and the goals is the process of policy analysis. Okay, so that process that the policy analysts use to determine if the policies that have actually been implemented are actually achieving a given set of goals, and they want to determine the relationship between the policies and the goals that were actually supposed to be met, and how those policies are actually achieving the goals. That is the process. That is actually the process of policy analysis. Please don't get confused. There are so many processes here when it comes to policy analysis, but if you read twice, you will actually understand. Make sure that you actually underline. Make sure that you actually underline the process of determining. So we want to determine which of the policies that are actually being implemented, are they achieving the goals that they were supposed to achieve, and we want to determine the relationship between those policies and the goals that we're supposed to achieve. So let me give an example, because I might forget to give you an example here, but I want to give you an example. For example, okay, when they were sitting down, when the stakeholders sat down to actually find out what are some of the policies that could actually improve our environment, because we want to reduce the environment and we want to empower people to keep the environment clean. So those were the goals. They had a goal to empower the public to keep the environment clean. They also had another goal to make sure that they actually protect the environment and stop pollution. So those are goals, right? So what happens in the process of making policy? They have this set of goals. They come up with strategies. Remember the proposals? They come up with the proposals and they actually determine out of these proposals, these are the policies we are going to set. For example, one of the policies that we have recently in our country is the plastic bag ban. That is a policy. It is meant to make sure that our environment stays clean. So you have a goal and you have a policy. The policy is the the plastic bag ban, and then the goal is to keep the environment clean. So when you come back to actually analyze this process, when you come back and you're trying to make sure that you actually you're analyzing that policy of plastic ban, what you're trying to determine is the relationship between that policy and the goals. Are the goals being met by that policy, or is that policy actually meeting other goals? Remember when we talked about some policies could be more harmful than being beneficial. So you're going to look at the relationship. Is it a positive relationship or is it a negative relationship? And you're going to talk about those things, but that's really what that process is all about. And I hope up to this point you're not confused. So we are looking at the relationship between the set of goals and the policy. Is that policy meeting the intended goals? Okay? Is stopping people from using plastic bags keeping the environment clean? That's all. That's all. That's all. Okay? All right. So another way we can actually look at policy analysis, an overview, is that what we want to do in the first stage of policy analysis, we want to break the problem into small components. Just like for example, if you have a puzzle and you really don't understand the puzzle, so you have to look at all the pieces of the puzzle so that you can be able to actually tell the story or what is going on, or to understand what kind of a puzzle you're dealing with. So you actually want to understand the components of that problem, which is a public problem, and of course develop the ideas about what needs to be done to solve the problems. So in a nutshell, it's still another way of discovering what are the social problems that you really need to address with certain policies that are either put in place, or certain policies that you actually want to recommend. That's about it. That's about it for that slide. It's simple to understand. Okay, so really for this slide, we are trying to actually, what we are trying to actually talk about here is just the why public policy analysis. That's what we are trying to look at. So for the policymakers to make decisions or to make new policies, in this case, the government of Kenya will need information that has, the information that has been gathered by the policy analysts in order to make new decisions or to make new laws. Okay, so exactly what we've been talking about. So looking at the relationship between the existing policy and the set goals, or the gender, so that they can go back and advise the stakeholders or the policymakers, in this case our government or the parliament, and tell them, hey, we do have some rules, we do have some policies that are actually helping the 190, or they are hurting the citizens. So here is the information that you've gathered from analyzing the policy, and that information is actually supposed to help the policymakers to make new decisions, or actually review the policies, or improve on the policies, or just get rid of some of the policies. But is this really what happens in our country? Is it what happens? But according to this class, this is what is supposed to happen. So when you guys go out there and you're making policy, you need to be fed by the policy analyst. You have to you have to make sure that it's this process of policy analysis that actually feeds into the system. when you're making new policies, make sure that you're not making the policies that have been actually uh, that are actually already there. You're looking at the old ones and you're making sure that there's some that are working and there's some that are not working, and how can you improve on them so that they actually save money, or they actually make sure that everybody is served like they're supposed to be served. So in this particular slide, we are trying to ask the question. We are actually trying to answer the question, what what this is what you're trying in this is the question we are trying to answer. What do the policy analysts do? What do the policy analysts do, and who are they? They help policymakers to make good policies. That's it. That's all you need to know. They help policymakers to make good policies. So when you have good analysts, when you have good analysts, and of course that this is not correctly let's see whether we can actually analyst analyst. Okay, yes, that's how you spell that word, policy analyst. I don't know, probably, whatever, something close. So what policy analysts do is that they help the policymakers to make good policies. The policy analysts don't have to be, they don't really have to be the stakeholders. They can be just people who are actually employed to analyze policy for a country or for a government or even for an organization. Remember, we don't just make policies for a country. We make policies for any governing body. It can be an organization, it can be your merry-go-round charmer. You make policies so that they can govern you. They don't have to be specialists or anything. All they do need to have is to have social skills, of course, social science skills. They need to understand the political system. They do need to understand the social problems of the 190 or the citizens. Anyone who understands the process of policy making can be a policy analyst, but you really don't have to be, you don't have to have any other special skills to be able to do that role. So that's what it is. So before we come to conclusion of this class, I want to make sure that we do understand the two major goals in policy analysis. The two major goals in policy analysis. So in case you forget everything else, remember, analysis of existing policy, that is a process of analytical and descriptive process attempt that is meant to attempt to explain policies and their development. Okay, so you're analyzing the existing policy because you want to make sure that you explain those policies and also explain how those policies were developed. And also remember, we also talked about, we are looking at the relationship between why they were developed and whether they are meeting the goals of why they were developed. Okay, so the other major goal is to make sure that we analyze for new policy. So we want to give a prescription involving formulating policies and proposals in order to improve the social welfare of the people. So this is where now we are actually talking about the difference between the major difference between policy analysis and policy evaluation, because policy evaluation is mainly looking at the existing policy, while policy analysis is you're looking at the existing policy and you're also looking at what are other what are other policies, what are other proposals that you could actually bring on the table to improve the social welfare of the citizens, considering that you already have the existing policy, just making sure that they're actually meeting the needs, and if they're not meeting the needs, what can we bring on the table from probably the proposals that were there in the beginning or the new proposals to make sure that we actually say we can come up with a new policy to replace a bad policy. I hope this makes sense, but if you were to be asked the difference between policy analysis and policy evaluation, that would be a very major difference, a very, very distinctive component that you can actually mention. That policy analysis, we look at the existing policy and we also look at the new policy. While in policy evaluation, you are just actually looking at the existing policy. All right, sawa sawa. I hope that is clear, and I hope that is clear. So we have the analytical and descriptive, and we also have the prescriptive. That means you can actually prescribe. Oh, that is the word from prescription. So you can prescribe other ideas or other policies to actually say, okay, we have this old policy, we have this. For example, let me give you an example. Okay, we said that the reason that the major goal of NEMA, let's say NEMA, came up with this plastic bag ban. They said, okay, we're not going to use any more plastic bags because we are polluting our environment, because our environment is full of plastic bags. And of course, we laid down a policy and we implemented it, because if you are caught trying to use those plastic bags, you're going to go to jail. All right, that is an existing policy. So when you're doing your analysis, you can come say, all right, we have this policy. People are not using plastic bags, and and yes, the environment is clean, but we are actually punishing some people. And I know this is a discussion that we've had in class, and of course probably developed a debate, because some people don't agree, and definitely it's a healthy debate. But a policy analyst is going to come back here and say, all right, we have this policy, we are keeping our environment clean, but at the same time, there is something that you have actually denied the citizens. That is, the citizens are still asking for an alternative. For example, how do we pack our githeri? How do we pack our sukuma wiki? Because we can't go carrying those plastic containers everywhere in matatus in our classrooms, because you're going to go home after class to go buy some sukuma wiki from from Gashororo or from Moshada. So how are we going to solve this problem? Because mainly the people who are using those plastic bags, they actually realize that it was a problem to the environment, but they also have said, okay, we need our plastic bags because we are suffering. So what an analyst would do is go back to the policies. You remember there were proposals that were being formulated when they were choosing this policy. They definitely had other proposals. So you go back to the proposals and say, I want to prescribe a new policy to replace the plastic bag ban. What would that look like? What would a new prescriptive look like? For example, we can say, okay, we're gonna bring back the paper bags. That's gonna be a policy. We bring back the paper bags, but every time you go to buy a new paper bag, you actually have to produce two other paper bags that are ready for recycle. You actually have a policy that is actually still leaving the environment clean, because for you to be allowed to buy a new paper bag, you have to actually produce the old paper bags, or the ones that you actually were needing to dispose of instead of throwing them on the street. Just like the tree cutting policy. For you to cut one tree, you have to plant two trees. We used to have such kind of a policy. Is it still existing? No, but a policy analyst can come back and say, okay, we were doing very, very well 20 years back, or when Wangari Maathai was alive, and we were planting trees. Now, because she's no longer there, nobody's enforcing a policy. So how can we bring back a new policy that actually empowers people to plant trees without necessarily being punished, or being prosecuted, or whatever it is? I know right now in the country we have another ban for wood cutting, and nobody is cutting wood right now. It's a policy. It's actually a policy. If you are caught cutting trees, you go to jail. Definitely go to jail. Last time I was in Kenya, we were buying, I think, a foot of wood. I remember, I think it was 6 by 1. We used to buy it at 20 shillings. Now I hear it's like almost 100 bucks. So that's when you can say, okay, we have an existing policy. We don't cut trees in this country, but we are actually making people suffer, because the few the few pieces of wood are actually in the market that people are selling are overpricing them. So this is a good policy. Yes, it's keeping our environment clean, and we're having rains, but somebody else is suffering. So people are going to be homeless because there are no houses that are being built. And people who don't have a lot of money are going probably to choose to build wooden houses, but now they can't because the prices have been hiked. So as a policy analyst, you come back and say, hey, government, we need to do something. This policy is great. This policy is keeping our environment clean, but we do need to look at these other proposals, keep the environment clean, and at the same time improve social welfare or social well-being of the citizens. Okay, that's what it is about that. All right, everybody, we are coming to the closure of our lesson. Today, I wanted to introduce you to a new model actually called the rationalist. I hope you guys know where that word come from. You're not being irrational, you're being rational. So this is why it's called the rational decision making process. It's a model by Taylor that was developed in 1998. This is a policy or analysis process or decision making whereby they use definite steps. You can see step 1 all the way up to step 6. So where you start by defining the problem, the social problem, or actually you want to write down your goals. What are some of the goals that you want to achieve with your policy? What is your plan? How do you want to address the social issues? And this is really a process just like the one we use for policy making process, but you can see there is a little bit of difference. You identify those problems, and of course you want to evaluate the policy alternatives that are actually in place. We also talked about making suggestions or looking at the old proposals that were actually laid down when they were coming up with the policy, and of course it's followed by policy implementation. So you want to implement the new plans or the improved plans, and of course you end by making sure that you monitor the implemented policy. So I hope you can study that model, and because it's definitely something that you're likely to be tested about. It's very, very simple, but just remember that this is rational rather than just coming up with ideas from nowhere. You're actually following steps. You're following steps to do your policy analysis, and that's why it's being called rationalist model. So I want to wish you all the best in everything that you are going to be doing for the rest of the week. If you have any questions, definitely I would like you to ask me. I would like you to reach out to me. If something that is not clear, I can definitely answer those questions. And of course, I have made everything simple because definitely this is a different kind of mode of teaching, but I really appreciate you guys being flexible. So I will see you later. Thank you, and have a blessed day.